afternoon, Council Member Kalos and member of the Committee on Health. My name is Dr. Lori Hoepner. I'm a colleague of Dr. Rao's for nearly 20 years at Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health. I'm also an assistant professor of environmental and occupational health sciences at the SUNY Downstate School of Public Health. My DrPH is in environmental health sciences from Columbia University. My MPH is in maternal and child health from Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And I come here today to speak not only as an environmental health expert with over 50 co-authored publications on the effects of environmental exposures on children, but also as a private citizen, a New York City native-born Brooklyn resident, and mother of 2 children, one of whom attends public school in Council Member Eugene's district. Children are the most vulnerable among us simply due to the effect of body burden and mode of exposure. Their bodies are small and exposure to pesticide is large in comparison to an adult. In particular, major public health concerns are repeated exposures to pesticides and the problem of exposure mixtures. That is exposure to more than one pesticide and or other chemicals simultaneously and over time. In terms of mode of exposure, anyone who's ever watched a toddler or a young child has seen them stick their hands and other objects in their mouths repeatedly without any concern for exposure to a variety of unpleasantness. Pesticides in many cases are persistent chemicals, some with unpleasant histories. For instance, chlorpyrifos, which Dr. Rao had mentioned, is a pesticide which was banned for residential use by the EPA, but is still permitted for agricultural and commercial use, including in New York State. The original iteration of the chemical formulation for chlorpyrifos was nerve gas, which was used in World War II. That is just one example. Once a pesticide is sprayed on a lawn in Central Park, Prospect Park, Van Cortlandt Park, Flushing Meadows Park, Silver Lake Park, or any other green space our wonderful city has to offer children to roam free with grass under their feet, that pesticide does not disappear when the pesticide application warning signs are removed. And as a reminder, warning signs tend to be about an 8x11 size piece of paper in English and illegible to anyone who doesn't have literacy, such as a child or someone who doesn't read English. The issue of pesticide exposure sticks with me because it sticks to my children, and every day that we delay action, another child is exposed. Please support your and Council Member Rosenthal's proposal to amend Section 17-1203 of the Administrative Code prohibiting the use of chemically based pesticides on property owned or leased by New York City. Thank you.
In your testimony, you introduced tonight a concept that I think was a little bit missing from the previous dialogue around a cosmetic pesticide. So in the city's testimony, they spoke about the health effects of if they don't use chemicals. What are the health effects if they do not use cosmetic pesticides? And if you can elaborate on that a little more.
Right, so I kind of wanted to distinguish between, for example, some of the pesticides, and I think they are moving a little bit away from the organophosphate pesticides, but they're still permitted for use in the city, which is a problem which I wrote into my written testimony, and I'm glad that that was addressed. But I know that there are always going to be exemptions to the local laws that govern which pesticides can be used, for example, in an emergency situation. So we saw the Zika outbreak the past couple of summers, not here, thankfully, but the city did have to ramp up measures and have in their arsenal certain chemicals which can be used to target adult mosquitoes. And so that is not necessarily a cosmetic use of a pesticide. That's pesticides used in response to a potential public health threat. When we talk about the use of herbicides like glyphosate like 2,4-D, which is a part of Agent Orange as well, and a neurotoxin, to eliminate weeds in the parks, then I think we're really talking about a cosmetic use. City agencies may differ with that opinion and say that these are not just being used for cosmetic purposes, but generally the elimination of weeds and creation of this beautiful green uniform lawn is thought to be a cosmetic use of a pesticide. So I think it's important to make that distinction and think about whether we need to get rid of all the weeds in our parks with these toxic chemicals, and why not just let them be a little weedy, or use other methods in IPM. I'm not sure how extensively the city has explored other methods for weed elimination that would reduce the use of cosmetic herbicides and pesticides.
Now, our last panel, our panelist at the end of the table indicated that you were in favor of banning glyphosate, but we're not necessarily in terms of with the legislation's broader goal of banning the synthetic pesticides, especially when there were biological or natural alternatives. Sometimes sometimes you have a machete, sometimes you have a scalpel. The goal is trying to get to it. Do you have specific concerns about the broader ban or specific changes?
I was just responding to what the horticulture specialist said and what the health department said in terms of a total ban on all chemicals would make their job extremely difficult. And I am not familiar with the whole suite of herbicides. I was just hoping there might be some available that were, relatively benign. I can't name any, I don't know, but I would hope that the city would do research into seeing if there were indeed some herbicides that seem to be pretty benign, and that would be a supplement to their use of biological pesticides as the main thing to do. Just trying to enable them to do their job without too much trouble. But I can't recommend any particular chemical that might fit that bill.
We've spent a lot of time talking about glyphosate. Are there other specific similar cosmetic or other pesticides that any of you on this panel have specific concerns about based on the local law 37 reports that the city may be using in excess or not necessarily needing to use?
I think that the organophosphate insecticide chlorpyrifos would fall in that category.
And to Dr. Hoepner, just a quick question around the signage. So in your experience, you've seen that there is the spraying of pesticides, the signage comes down, and so I guess the question is, in your expert opinion, do the impacts and effects of the pesticides outlast the signage rules? Does our legislation need to expand signage requirements to say, no, once you spray it has to go off for whatever the clinical language would be for the life of that pesticide remaining in that area? Do we need to make sure that there's an open data set so that folks can have an app for that, and then also perhaps even add saying that it can't be an 8.5 by 11, it has to be ledger at all intersections, and it needs to be available in the 7 or 9 spoken languages in that specific area? But I'll throw it to you. But that's just me riffing on what I heard.
Okay, well, I'm a strong believer in health communication, health literacy, and in terms of the signage, so you asked a few questions. In terms of the signage, if the MTA can do it, I think that New York City Parks and Recreation, Central Park Conservancy, whoever it is that would be responsible for putting those signs up, can do it as well. Visuals are a huge aid. We live in a visual society now. Icons and graphics are very important. Color and multiple languages. Again, the MTA can do it. We can do it here too, in terms of various languages and color and graphics. As far as the timing of exposure and how long that lasts, or how long the chemical will lay deposited on the surfaces, it really depends on the chemical. So that's a hard question to answer generally, but in general, yes, they tend to outlast, especially if there are pesticides that are petroleum-based. Petroleum-based products are oily, they don't wash off easily, and then other chemicals, which are the persistence, of course, the concern is the persistence in the body over repeated exposures. So if a child goes into a playground, into a park, or any human, any animal goes into a park multiple times, they have repeated exposures potentially, and the effects are, this is something that everybody sitting at this table continues to study, as well as many other experts in the field. So these are difficult questions to answer, but if they're perhaps signage, or as you suggested, an app, of course, that also speaks to environmental justice and whether everybody has a cell phone available to them or access to the internet, Wi-Fi. If we had Wi-Fi in the parks, that would be wonderful. So ways to get that message out, perhaps PSAs. I mean, there's a plethora of options out there that could work. But I strongly believe that notifying people and keeping them constantly informed, people are humans, they start to ignore the signs, right? So even if you keep a sign up in perpetuity, they might start ignoring them. So just perhaps different ways to signal people over time.
And so just asking in your other hat as a parent, so you wake up early, kids are running around the house, okay, we're going to take them to the park. If you can share, if for the parents on the panel, and want to apologize, I introduced legislation that would allow there to be childcare at these hearings, so it wouldn't cost you money to come. You could actually have your kids looked after in a similar fashion as we just had several dozens and dozens looked after. But I guess if you can talk to the ordeal that it is going through to get your kids to the park, and what would happen even among sophisticated folks if you get there and like they are there to play on the grass and play in the park, but there's a sign that says, oh, we sprayed pesticides, and what even the most educated among us would do in the type of choice, and what ends up happening.
Sometimes we let them play and we wash their hands very carefully, and we don't eat when we're in those spaces, but we typically would look for a different space when we see that yellow sign or the signage posted. I also want to give a plug for the importance of outdoor play and green spaces. So we feel very passionately that children should be outdoors. So there's a balance between really scaring families away from the parks as well, and telling them this is toxic, don't go here, because it's beneficial for their kids to be outside and exposed to green spaces. So we have to be a little bit careful about that. And like I said, I have twins and they're 2. So sometimes they really, really need to be outside and run free. And I'm nervous, but I want to let them play. So it's a real conflict for families.
And I agree. I will readily admit that my 12-year-old son's among his first words was chemical. And he learned not to go under the kitchen sink very quickly. I think all of us, again, could go on for hours about all of the exposures that our children are experiencing in the city and across the country. So pesticides are not the only question. They're not, as I mentioned, with repeated exposures and multiple exposures, they're not the only exposure that children have. So I agree that it's not necessary to scare people away from parks, but also if I do see anything about pesticides that have been sprayed, or if there's a treated lawn, my children will not be playing on it. Often it's in Prospect Park, which is where we tend to go. It's often fenced off, so that helps to keep them away. But again, you have to choose your exposures wisely and be cognizant. And I think the idea of health education, environmental health education, comes strongly into play here. Empowering people with the knowledge is really the end game, and then they can choose what they do with that knowledge. But it behooves the city council, it behooves the city to help people understand what is being applied to the public green space.